Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dream Leapers. I'm your host, Harriette Cole, and we have a very special guest today. Our guest is someone I've known for many, many years. I can't remember how we met, but what I love about her from the moment we met is her love of our history, in particular, her family's history. And she has had an incredible career and then devoted tons of time and effort and energy and love to researching her family. So let me tell you about her. We are honored to welcome a woman whose legacy and lineage are as profound as the stories she tells. A'Lelia Bundles is an award-winning journalist, biographer, and author whose work has uplifted the narratives of trailblazing Black women like her great-great-grandmother and America's first self-made woman millionaire. Yes, you hear that? Madam C.J. Walker. That's right. You heard me. A'Lelia Bundles comes from a rich family history and has made it her business to preserve it, archive it, and share it with the world. A'Lelia has written several books, including the New York Times notable On Her Ground, which inspired the Netflix series Self-Made, starring Octavia Spencer. Her latest book, Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, which just hit the shelves earlier this week, highlights the vibrance and power of A'Lelia Walker, another pioneering woman in her family. A'Lelia Bundles nurtured an award-winning career in network television news for 30 years, which ultimately prepared her to be the historian she is today. She is the founder of Madam Walker Family Archives, the largest private collection of Walker photographs, memorabilia, and ephemera. A'Lelia Bundles' continued commitment to discovering and documenting the untold stories of her ancestry helped reveal a lineage of innovation and empowerment. A'Lelia Bundles is proof that our ancestors' wildest dreams can often live on in us. Please join me in welcoming A'Lelia Bundles.
Harriette, it's always so good to be with you. And yes, I can't remember when we met, but I just know that I'm in your fan club.
Well, back at you. Well, as you do know, we were just talking about this off camera. My mother recently passed. She was 95 years old, and we just celebrated her life. And it had us, my sisters and me, going into our family archives, into old photos, into stories, talking to her friends who are 95 to 100 about their memories and just the treasure that these memories are. And one thing that you've done in your book so beautifully is to give context. You know, that's what we tried to do at Her Service, to give context. What does it mean to have grown up in the 30s and 40s? What does it mean? And I appreciate so much that approach that you have taken to telling your family stories, because it's not just the individual, but it's all the things that were happening around these members of your family that paint a picture of the evolution of our country. So can you talk about that research aspect to storytelling that is such a rich part of your work?
You know, I thank you so much for noticing just the context. And, you know, when I was writing, probably like me, you did not have a lot of Black history in school. If you did, yay. but I didn't even know
Howard University. When I got to Howard, then we have the immersion.
There you go, the capstone.
Yes.
But we both grew up in families with really accomplished parents, and but everybody's family has amazing people. So it's not, you know, it's not just they don't have to be accomplished. They, you know, in the sort of traditional measurement of that, families are important. And what I realized when I was doing the research for On Her Own Ground, the biography of Madam Walker, and then with Joy Goddess, is that I didn't want to just only tell their stories. I wanted to tell the stories of the world around them, of the people they knew, of what Black people were doing, because we did not learn that in school. And so I needed to create that environment and that context to say what else was going on during history. So with their lives, I think I've been able to kind of reframe the narrative of Black women, using the women in my family from the Civil War and enslavement through World War I through A'Lelia Walker's life in the 20s, through the Depression, and then talk about what that means for us today.
And I mean, you do an excellent job of that. And the amount of research, I want you to go into what research looks like, because a lot of people write memoirs, a lot of people write about their family, and no disrespect, but sometimes it's very cursory, you know? And while that can be interesting, what I find so valuable about your work is that it is a true history lesson. There are a lot of pieces to the puzzle. So you take people into what was it like in the lead up to World War I was fascinating in your current book. I think a lot of people, we don't talk about World War I that much. So
yeah, I mean, I think that, the general rule is, history is boring, and people are like, oh, I don't really want to know that history. And so there is how you thread that needle in writing a biography, is just give people just enough, but it really has to be grounded in fact. And so I'm going to tell you, for every sentence, that's probably 2 or 3 days worth of research. I mean, it took me a really long time, but you really have to understand it in order to be able to explain it briefly to people. The first version of this book was probably twice as long. And fortunately, I had a good editor who said, you do want people to read this. And so you have to just distill it and extract the most important pieces. But I think when we think that history is boring and we think it's too dense, we shortchange ourselves and we miss what the ancestors were going through. So I really wanted us to understand each generation has its own struggles. And yes, World War I, that's when, Black folks, that was the new Negro. That's when Black folks were coming back from the war, where they had seen France. They had new expectations about how they were supposed to be treated. And the backlash that happened then, with lynchings, with resentment of Black soldiers, with the resentment of Black folks in cities who were asserting themselves, we see some parallels today. People came back, Black Lives Matter, people wanted to assert themselves. The backlash to that has been, as we know, tremendous.
And I mean, one thing that's kind of frightening when we look at this history is how similar it is. Obviously, strides have been made, so we cannot erase that. But with every swell of a stride, there is the pendulum swings both ways, and we see a lot of pushback. How dare you? When we talk about Madam C.J. Walker, because she really begins this story of your family lineage, that she was what was called a washerwoman, right? That was isn't that what you described? That right? When she was washing clothes. So many of us have this story, so many of us, if we know just 1 or 2 generations back in our families, we know that for the most part, post-slavery, most people worked in servitude in one way or another, most Black people. Right. My grandmother, who lived to be 101, who was born in 1889, was a maid. She was a housekeeper. And she worked, by the way, until she was 93. Wow. When my mother's like, girl, you got to stop working. You got to come home. But it was, it was the work ethic. People believed that there was no such thing as retirement back then. You worked. And I love the way you frame Madam C.J. Walker's story to let people understand. She's like, wait a minute. I don't think I can do this when I get old. I have to figure out something else. Can you describe her and the kind of person she was and how she went from this labor job and was able to convert it into tremendous wealth and vision?
Yeah, but so, Madam Walker's story is really the arc of American history, from the Civil War through emancipation, Reconstruction, and the sort of the new Negro realizing our aspirations. And she was born Sarah Breedlove in 1867 on the same plantation in Louisiana, where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. first child in her family born free. Married at 14, widowed at 20 with a daughter, Alelia, who's the subject of the new book. And at that point, moved from Louisiana to St. Louis, where her older brothers had moved a decade earlier, really escaping racial violence and the backlash to the election of 1876. But once she got to St. Louis, her brothers who were barbers, they had a little bit more status than the average laborer. They were members of St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. The women of the church began to give Sarah Breedlove a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. Fast forward, her hair begins to fall out because of hygiene issues when most people didn't have indoor plumbing and electricity. She develops a hair care product through trial and error and through exposure to others, and then turns that into a business where she provides jobs for thousands of women, becomes an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and a political activist. But that arc is something that, you know, we see even now with people who say, I've been laid off from my federal job. I don't have enough education. I can't find something else, who realize that the way that they can take care of themselves and their families is to figure out a way out of no way. How do you go into business for yourself? How do you fulfill a need? And that's what she did.
It's an amazing story. And as you point out, it is the American story. It's what so many people experience of all different backgrounds. And in her case, and as you describe in Joy Goddess, she has a daughter. So her daughter definitely sees the struggle. She's born early enough in Madam Walker's life that struggle was still real. But wealth came pretty soon, and Alelia gets to experience, oh, there's another side of life. This can be great. And we can, and then the whole idea of coming from New York, because I think she was in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh, I have an uncle who lived in Pittsburgh, and I'm from Baltimore. So those were similar, those cities. But New York then and now was like, whoo. The world was different. Opportunity was different. And because there was some wealth building occurring, Alelia got to see that life could be very different. Can you describe that?
So when Alelia was poor, when they were poor in St. Louis, they were struggling, and Alelia went through that struggle with her mother. But when Madam Walker began to make money, Alelia was, a young adult at that point. So she had, most of her life had been a struggle. But now they had cars and furs and homes and travel, international travel. And she was experiencing that. And like many parents, Madam Walker wanted her child's life to not be as much of a struggle as hers. And so therein begins to lie a rub where the founding person goes through the struggle. They're protecting their child. And in some ways, the child will lose some of that, that struggle bone that sort of motivated the first generation. And at the same time, Alelia had her own really interesting ideas about how to promote the company. But it's hard to live up to the sort of the founder. It's hard to live up to a really accomplished parent. And we see that today. How does a parent both provide for a child and help them learn how to overcome obstacles and do the struggle, and at the same time not spoil them so much that they are not able to function? How do you help them find their own path?
Okay, so I want to just point out to everybody who's listening that point, because while we are talking about this incredible family legacy, that point you just made, Alelia, is so important, especially at this generation when, I have a 21-year-old. I'm hoping that we have instilled in her, the understanding that you have to work really hard. And at the same time, we give her so much more than our parents did, than our grandparents did, because you feel like you have to. And so then there's that push-pull, well, are we giving enough so that our children are hungry and that they're striving? It's so tough. It's so tough.
It is, and so I have to joke with people, because I do come from this family, Madam C.J. Walker, first self-made American woman millionaire. Amazing story. And when I was growing up, my mother was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. So I would go with her to her office in Indianapolis and visit the ladies in the factory and, play on her typewriter and adding machine. But the last thing I thought I would be doing is telling this story. I mean, I was not, going into the family business. There was no expectation from my parents that I do so. And my father was president of another Black hair care company. So, and people think, well, why didn't you do that? And didn't you have a trust fund? No, I did not. But my mother was so wise about letting me follow my own passion. And I love to write. At an early age, at 8 years old, I had a little story published in the Jack and Jill magazine, Up the Hill. So I thought I was a writer. And that turned into my career. But that's what I wanted to do. And my parents never asked me to veer from that. It was really Phyllis Garland, who was my professor when I was at Columbia in journalism school. She was the only Black woman on the faculty in the fall of 1975. And I was running as far away as I could from this family story. And when we talked about my master's paper, I gave her some cliched topics. And at the end of the conversation, she said, "Your name is A'Lelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker?" And I said, "Yeah, that's my family." And
she's said, like, "Hello."
Yeah, right. She said, "That's what you're going to write about." So I had this parallel of, Phil validated this for me. I still developed my career, but all of those things, as you said, all of the preparation, being a producer and an executive in network television news, was preparing me to tell this profound story. But I don't think I would.
That is so good. Let me just pause for 1 second. I got to get a little idea in here. We're having so much fun. I forgot to tell you, this is Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole. We are talking with A'Lelia Bundles, who is just unraveling this incredible family history that she has, and also dropping some wisdom for all of us about things we need to think about as we build our families and our lives. So we appreciate you for that, A'Lelia. I want to go back. This notion, usually, and I've interviewed so many people, about how they're manifesting their dreams. And usually, if not always, there is someone in that person's life who sees something in them, who pushes, who helps to turn the light on and say, look at that. So this professor helped you so much to see the obvious, right?
To see the obvious. I mean, it happened at a key moment. The fall of 1975, the first Black woman on the faculty. So we were at that moment that you and I experienced, where the world was opening up, when Black professors were being hired, when doors were opening up in corporations. That is the backlash to that, is what we are seeing now. You cannot close that door entirely, but we benefited from that. But during the fall of 1975, my mother was in Indianapolis, and she had lung cancer, terminal lung cancer. I totally could not conceive of what that meant. But when I went back to Indianapolis for the holidays, for Christmas, my mom was in the hospital, and I talked to her. I said, "I'm writing this paper on Madam Walker, and I'm finding, Madam Walker's not perfect." Well, nobody's perfect. And I said, "What do I do about that?" And she was leaned up in her hospital bed, and she said, "Tell the truth, baby. It's all right to tell the truth." So I had both this combination of Phyllis Garland validating the story for me beyond somebody in my family, and my mother saying, "Tell the whole story. It's okay to tell the whole story." And that made such a difference for me. And it is the power of a professor.
And the power of a mother. I mean, those together, I'm getting goosebumps, because so many people who have written about their families, made films, whatever, often wait until somebody dies, because I can't tell this because they won't appreciate it. And because no one story is so-called perfect. There are always flaws. I mean, life would be so boring if we only did the right thing all the time, right? But many people have said, well, I just can't tell that story until so-and-so has left the planet. Your mother's saying, giving her blessing, tell the story.
Right. It was an
So
amazing gift.
Mm. And so, another thing that you just were mentioning is preparation. I so believe that everything that happens in our lives gets us ready for the next thing. And in your case, 30 years in television at that time too, because in the 70s, moving into the 80s, doors were opening across the United States for Black people. And storytelling, when you get Black folks in the room, so then whenever you get somebody in the room who can help tell the story in a different way, it makes it a more profound story. But also, I'm going to guess that there was a lot of conflict that you must have experienced being a Black woman rising up in the media. Can you talk about your career and what some of the hurdles were that you had to jump?
So I graduated from Columbia, from the journalism school in the spring of this. I graduated from Columbia's journalism school in the summer of 1976.
Okay.
And I was part of an early push to bring women and African Americans into network television news. And so I went to work in a management training program at NBC and moved from radio to television, ended up in the Houston bureau, then the Atlanta bureau, then DC by 1985. And I was fortunate to have some great mentors along the way. Who really, let me make mistakes and let me get experience. But I was really one of the first women and one of the first Black people to be a producer in network television news. Again, I had mostly people who were supportive, but of course there were people who were not happy that I was there and pushed back. But I did have people who were helpful. But I would say one of the most frustrating things for me is that, yes, we were in the room, and we were able to push certain stories or make sure that a perspective was there. But I sometimes found that, when we were doing a story that had to do with Black people, like I was in the room and I would offer my perspective, but it would still get dismissed, as not. And I think one of the things I remember most is when the O.J. Simpson trial was happening, I had zero interest in that trial. But at that point, I was the only Black producer for World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, which is like ridiculous because it's the 90s. But they wanted to do a story on the race card, that aspect of the trial. And so they sent me to LA. And now I'm thinking, you're sending me because you want me to bring you a perspective that apparently somebody else cannot bring. So I interviewed the editor of the LA Sentinel, the head of the Urban League in LA. I talked about, the Black folks who believed that O.J. Simpson was innocent, even though I thought he was guilty. But I wanted that perspective. So we get to the editing portion, the scripting and the editing, and what gets left out? Those voices get left. So why did you have me go? So that did not happen all of the time. But that was memorable to me. It's because we need those perspectives. And we're now, things are much better now in terms of who you see on camera. I mean, even Harriette, how people can wear their hair. I mean, at that point, you could be on radio or work for print and have natural hair. Now I'm just sort of excited because I see all of it, from Ketanji Brown Jackson to all of the correspondents, especially the attorneys who are on MSNBC and other places. But things have really changed, and at the same time, there's still frustration.
Yeah. And when you started, I'm going to assume this, but you tell me if it's true. The images of Black people in media were and sometimes still are stereotypical. Criminals, drug dealers, poor people, not admirable people for the most part, for a long time. Because, I grew up at Essence and then later Ebony, and part of what those publications did was to celebrate Black life, because many times the images that you would see in newspapers and on the news were highlighting the negative. In your work as a producer, because that's such an important role to be behind the scenes and do your best to craft the stories, how challenging was it to push back on stereotypical thinking?
Right. Well, there were some victories and there were some defeats. I mean, two things that come to mind. There was some story that had, people on welfare, and the B-roll, the sort of file footage that was in the videotape library. Of course, all of the people on welfare were Black. And it was old footage. It had been there for a while, and it's easier to take video in cities because that's where we have bureaus. And I really pushed back against that and insisted that some camera crews go out and get some other images, because since most people who were receiving that aid to dependent families were not Black. So that was like, okay, we got some other footage. Then there was another point during the O.J. Simpson trial where we were looking at the images that were there. And I personally did a survey that was, reviewed by the leadership of the news division on how many times Asian Americans, Latinos, African Americans, women were on the Sunday public affairs show, how many times people were interviewed, how many times people were on World News Tonight. And, like Lance Ito, who was the judge and for the Simpson trial, was like the only Asian American who was on our air for like 6 months. So that was just, to show people data. This is what the reality is. You need to do something different. And we began to create a database of experts who were in the medical field, who were scientists, who were political scientists, who were ambassadors, to try to make sure that there were other go-to people. Now that has improved measurably in the last decade and a half. But at that point, it was like, well, Jesse Jackson could answer that for us. He was the only person who they would go to.
Right. And we had the other piece of stereotypical thinking that, well, we can't find anybody who's an expert in whatever this is or that is, because it's your go-to people are the people that the people who look like you. So, I mean, I think it was wonderful that you were behind the scenes at the time that you were, when things were really expanding. Were you able to bring people in?
Yes, we did. There was a point where we were trying to make sure that the people who were on the Sunday morning public affairs show, that there were some other voices, and we were able to do that. And while I was a producer for the first part of my career at NBC and then at ABC, and then I was deputy bureau chief in Washington. And then my last job was director of talent development. So that really was a position where I was able to sort of groom some of the young correspondents, to create a mentoring program for some of the younger employees, and then also to make some suggestions about people who were going to be on our air as experts.
That's so incredibly important. And so then there's a pivot. You have a full career, and then this incredible pivot. And this is so important, Lilia, especially for my audience, because many people who are looking to manifest their dreams are doing it because they're in transition. Like, oh, it's time for me to do something else. Sometimes it's because they got laid off. Sometimes it's because they had kids and shifted, how they spent their time. There are lots of reasons why people make a pivot. What was your reason to leave this very, full, robust career and to shift into a different kind of storytelling?
Well, yeah, you're right. Sometimes it's just time. I mean, you just know. I knew when I finished writing On Her Own Ground about Madam Walker, which actually came out in 2001, I knew then that I wanted to write a biography of A'Lelia Walker. But I had gotten this opportunity to be director of talent development. I was really enjoying that. And then, the industry was beginning to shift. And at that point, I was, what they would call a suit. I was a management person, not a person who was producing content, which is what I really loved. And I began to see, there were some things that I wasn't all that excited about that, that were going on at the top levels of the company. And I thought, it's time for me to really make my exit. And so I made a decision. There was an incident that happened, and I just said, time for me to go. And and one of my cardinal rules for myself always had been to keep enough money saved that if I had to leave that day, I could. But I waited 6 months. I saved some money. I put some things in place. I bought a new car when I still could get some credit to buy a new car. Put some things in place. And then I said, thank you. It's been great. And now I got to move on to the next thing. But it is preparation.
Yes.
And something else that I'm giving a commencement speech this month. And one of the things that I always say to young people is that, I hit bumps in my career. I hit barriers. Definitely. I had great mentors, but some people were not my fan and I was not their fan.
Sure.
But when I hit those barriers, I started participating in my college alumni organizations. I started doing some volunteer work. And that as a result, I was a trustee at Columbia because I had started to volunteer. I was very involved in my college alumni activities. And that allowed me to develop some leadership roles that I wasn't able to exercise in those moments of frustration in my career.
Excellent. Hey guys, this is Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole. We are talking with A'Lelia Bundles. She has a new book that has just come out and incredibly well written. It's called Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance. So A'Lelia, I want to talk some more about your book and about the story of A'Lelia Walker. First of all, just the writing. You take us into these experiences that I think a lot of people don't even think were true, because there's still the stereotype of Black people didn't have this wealth, didn't have, didn't know these people. I mean, I hate saying that out loud, but I've heard it so much that I know that people have these thoughts. For example, like when the Cosby Show came, well, there were no Black people living like that. Well, my family was just like that. And so were so many others. You show us A'Lelia coming into her own, working to honor her mother, as you mentioned before, having such a powerful mother, trying to find space for herself in that, but also really coming to understand the power of connection and community and care for the community. So can you talk a bit about what she came to be? And you may want to start that opening scene with the dinner party or whatever that party was. But tell us about who she became and what that meant for the culture.
I have really come to think of A'Lelia Walker as a convener. Yes, hostess, yes, but convener. And because she was able to build upon what her mother had established as a businesswoman, as a political activist, as a person who loved culture. So together, they knew everybody worth knowing. People wanted to be at their events. And A'Lelia Walker just took a page from her mother's example of bringing people together. So the book opens with a dinner scene in 1914. Madam Walker at that point is living in Indianapolis, where the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company is headquartered. And A'Lelia has persuaded her that they need to be in Harlem. And so they have bought a building on 136th Street in 1913. And now A'Lelia is trying to persuade Madam Walker to move her personal residence to New York. Leave the company headquartered in Indianapolis, where it's cheaper to do business, but come to New York so she can be in the political mix, in the cultural mix. And A'Lelia invites people, sort of about a dozen movers and shakers in Harlem, to this dinner party so that Madam Walker can begin to develop relationships with people like Fred Moore, who was the publisher of the New York Age, and with other business people and socialites in the city, musicians especially. James Reese Europe, who was he was like the Quincy Jones of his day, a
Mhm.
name that we don't know, but he was a guest and his group provided the music. So this is Alelia Walker saying, I know how to bring the political people, the cultural people together to both to make my mother happy, but also for them to interact with each other. And that was really kind of setting the stage for all of the things that she did for the next decade and a half in Harlem.
And among the things, she became a really good fundraiser. And as her mother had shown by her example, philanthropy was very important, helping to take care of the community and get those resources to go in different places. You tell a story about a wonderful event that she hosted where they were raising money to buy an ambulance for the Black troops, and that was for World War I, right?
For World War I. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that?
So yeah, so Alelia Walker and Madam Walker both loved music, and even when they were poor and living in St. Louis, Madam Walker, who was then Sarah Breedlove, had a good enough voice to be in the choir at St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. Madam Walker's brothers had a barbershop. That's where Black musicians often congregated. And for a while, they lived across the alley from Tom Turpin's Rosebud Cafe, where Scott Joplin played. So even when they were poor, music was a part of their lives. And as they became wealthy, a lot of their friends were musicians. Those were the people like Bert Williams, who had the money to travel. And so they would run into each other. So now once they're in Harlem, Alelia Walker is able to convene people, to bring people together.
Which was incredible. And she also learned the power of celebrity and was able to leverage that to help people to open those wallets and give when needed.
And you were asking me about the ambulance for World War I. So as Alelia Walker realized what a draw musicians were when she would host a party, she had become a member of a committee that was raising money for Black troops. Right. And she came upon this idea to not just to give cigarettes and socks, which is what most of the women's groups were doing, but let's raise money for an ambulance. And she and Madam Walker had developed a love of opera, even when they were poor. And so she had become friends with Enrico Caruso, the Italian operatic tenor. And she invited him basically to do a cameo at a fundraiser that she was doing at a big venue in Harlem. And she invited him, people bought tickets to be able to come see him. Now, that raised the money that they needed to buy this ambulance. So she knew the power, as you say, she knew the power of celebrity and the power of convening people, but also getting them to open their wallets.
And they did. And in the case of that story, he ended up not coming, and there was some backlash, but she still raised the money and they remained friends. So it ended up working out. There's something else that you described that I think often happens when people are in that ascent mode. And there were some folks who were jealous and who took a lot of jabs at both her and her mother. You know, the who do you think you are kind of attitude that got people to be hypercritical. How did she deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, there was some class, some old Black families who didn't think they belonged. And so they had to deal with that. There were other people who judged her that she wasn't as accomplished as her mother. And so they were, sort of looked down upon her. She kind of took it in stride. She had a really great sense of humor. But she was trying to do her own thing despite the criticisms. And, one of the things that I think sort of carried on and that I had to really unpack as I was doing my research and writing about her is that she has become, in many accounts of the Harlem Renaissance, kind of a caricature of the woman who I discovered. That there a couple of people, a few decades ago wrote a few paragraphs that said essentially Alelia Walker spent the money her mother made. Even one person who said she spent the 1920s playing bridge, as opposed to raising money for an ambulance. And so she's been kind of pigeonholed in that caricature and dismissive. I think some stories about women during the Harlem Renaissance have really diminished the role that women played. And so this has been, as we celebrate the centennial of the Harlem Renaissance, I think telling A'Lelia Walker's story, but so many of the other stories of women, are really trying to elevate them to the place where they deserve to be. So A'Lelia Walker was, diminished during her lifetime and sort of caricatured. And, even for many years, that story has been told and retold inaccurately. And now I want to let her shine on her own.
Which we appreciate. And I remember when the film came out, which on the one hand was exciting. Octavia Spencer's in this film. We love her. And you write about it in your book, you were disappointed. And I remember talking to you about this. And as a person who worked for so many years in television, how, where's the power and who gets to tell the story based upon the power. Can you tell us a little bit about what that dynamic is when you've got a book, here's all the information, and then somehow when it goes into the hands of other people who are telling the story, sometimes the lines are blurred.
Yes, the lines are blurred. As they said, there were creative differences. And you were such a great guide in helping me navigate that. Octavia Spencer was great. I mean, every time she came on camera, I thought she really embodies Madam Walker. But then there was the script, and the script was very different from what I would have imagined or wanted. I was hoping for Hidden Figures. I feel like I got a little bit of, Real Housewives of Atlanta, where there was a leaning into a conflict that was really kind of manufactured between Madam Walker and her main competitor, Annie Malone, who was also a very strong woman. So I learned a lot from that experience. And, fortunately, this new book, people are saying, this needs to be a series. It needs to be a film. It needs to be a musical. And so this time around, I am starting out by working with people I already know and with people who really share my vision. And at the same time, I know that I'm the person who writes the biography, who does the historical research. I'm not a person who has the skills to write a screenplay. You don't just wake up one morning and know how to do that. Right. There are some really talented people, and I'm fortunate that I'm working with some of them right now. So, this stuff takes a while. It could be another decade. I hope I'm still around, but I just learned a lot from that experience, and I want to put those lessons into play.
And I'm glad you are where you are now, because I remember how frustrating it was. And it's like, this is your baby. And when your baby gets taken and gets turned into something else, it's very hard. Also, when people don't fully understand history, they can sometimes light on something and make that more important than what the bigger picture is. That's part of just the dynamics of working with people and what folks know and don't know. But this book, well, you've gotten so many people. There's so many quotes talking about how much people are enjoying the book, people of every possible background. I think, as I mentioned from the beginning, because not only did you do the research, but you figured out how to tell it so it doesn't read like an academic book. It could easily just be an academic book because of all of the information in there. How challenging was it to keep the story narrative when you were weaving in so many facts?
I had really nice editors, really good editors. Catherine Belden and Rebecca Jett and Simon and Schuster were great, because I had a lot of rabbit holes. I had been working on this book for, I'm embarrassed to say, 20 years. So there were a lot of stories that I wanted to tell. And, people like Geraldine Dismond, who was Jerry Major, who became the society columnist for Jet for many years. I could have written a whole book on Jerry, but, now she just kind of appears. I could have written a lot more about A'Lelia Walker's first, second, and third husbands, but I needed to have the narrative flow. So yes, it is a challenge, but having gone through the writing process, the research process, meeting people who helped me with research,
Mm,
visiting a number of archives and manuscript collections, interviewing some of the elders when they were still living in the 80s. I mean, it was an amazing journey, and I just wanted to do them all justice so that 50 years from now, when there's a person like me who's trying to read about the Harlem Renaissance, they have a piece that's readable and accurate. And thank you so much for loving the writing, because as a writer,
yes.
this is the thing that you just fret about and worry about. And I'm
Yes.
now enjoying this wonderful moment when people are saying they've read the book and this is what they
Mhm.
like about it. When you write, you don't know how a
It's
story is
true.
going to land, and you just hope that it's going to land in the way, in ways you can't even know, but that it's going to land well.
Well, this one surely does. Hey guys, this is Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole. We're speaking right now with A'Lelia Bundles. We just have a few minutes left. We're talking about her latest book, Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance. So you mentioned, A'Lelia, this is the 100th anniversary of the Harlem Renaissance. That's amazing. And, I live in Harlem. Harlem has changed so much. You talk about in your book what Harlem was like, this incredible migration of Black people to Harlem, did it begin in the 20s?
Well, a little really earlier, around 1900, but yes, the 20s is the big put. Post World War One was when thousands
Right,
of people were coming.
right. And so it's changing. The racial mix is changing again. But the legacy of Harlem and what it has meant, and the creative people who've come out of Harlem is so rich. And your book, which is seated during this time of the Harlem Renaissance, really does help to paint a picture of what was going on. Who were some of the people who A'Lelia Walker met and entertained and worked with, who would be people who were very important during that period?
So James Reese Europe, a musician, an amazing composer who led the band of the 369th Regiment in France, was an amazing person, but who was murdered in 1919, soon after he returned. But that's a name people should know. Just Fletcher Henderson, a band leader, Bessie Bearden, who was Romery Bearden's mother, but who also was the society columnist for a number of Black newspapers, as well as the first Black woman on a school board in New York. Geraldine Dismond, known later as Jerry Major, was the society columnist for the other half of the Black newspapers. And those were two of A'Lelia Walker's best friends. Because of them, I'm able to tell her story in detail, because they wrote about what everybody ate and drank and wore
Right.
at these parties. Noble Sissel, U.B. Blake, just all of the people that are the big names of the Harlem Renaissance. Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Paul and Essie Robeson. These were people who were at her parties. W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, on and on. Everybody who was anybody came to her parties. Now, of course, there were a few snobs who didn't come, but I think that she was all right with that.
Yeah. It's so important to hear these names. And in your book, you can read about these people and the relationship that A'Lelia Walker had to them. I want to say to folks also, go to the Schomburg, do some research, go to events now that are celebrating the Harlem Renaissance, because this is a time to immerse ourselves in the history. I think it definitely can fill us and just make you feel proud, and of the legacy that is part of our history. But as we part, I want to congratulate you again on your book that has just come out, Joy Goddess. It is really a testament to your commitment to sharing your family story through a historical lens so that we all can benefit from just knowing a lot more about what happened not that many years ago. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to see you.
You too. And thank all of you for tuning in. This book, I want to tell you, you can read it on the beach wherever you are, but here's the book, Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, written by A'Lelia Bundles, celebrating her family and a rich part of American history. Until next time, have a great day and make it count.